Good morning, listeners. It is 10 o'clock on the 5th of October 2017. And since morning, I've had a couple of comments on Facebook, and I've sent out an email to people. I put a blog post out, and I think it's something which I would like to explain at some more length through this podcast. So the issue that I've been talking about is the complete uselessness of those who tell us through hand waving, kind of policies, suggestions that we need economic reforms in India. And to them, I say very clearly that, look, we have done about half the economic reforms that we needed to do. There is another half that needs to be done, including in agriculture and in many other parts of the economy. But let me assure you that it is virtually impossible to get good results purely with economic reforms. What we don't notice about China, and most people who study economics and development economics have no clue about it, is that China paid a lot of attention to the Singapore model and applied many of the learnings of that model to its own governance systems and accountability processes since roughly the 1980s. And so as a result of that, China has had two series of reforms, not just economic reforms, which people commonly know about. And this reform is probably more important in the long run than the economic reform, for even economic reforms cannot really work in the absence of a governance system that is 100% inefficient and incompetent, and of course then corrupt, like we have in India. So we have this great faith and belief in India that we have the steel frame of the IAS and all that stuff. And I've talked about this in a separate podcast, and I won't go into more details there. But I want to sort of go back to the point that anybody who doesn't understand governance has no business to tell us what we need to do in India. The kind of knowledge that people like Lee Kuan Yew had, the kind of instinct, let us say, that he had, is based on some of the world's finest, economic understandings. When I talk a lot about Chanakya, and this is something I discovered much later after writing my book Breaking Free of Nehru, I discovered that Chanakya actually had a very fine and detailed understanding of how incentives apply within a government system. So when we read Arthashastra, we work out the implied logic of Chanakya's recommendations to the king. Arthashastra is basically a set of recommendations, a training manual for the king. Nobody else needed to be trained so much on governance as the king. And so Arthashastra was used in ancient India to teach the kings. And Chanakya wrote the Arthashastra, and there were many Arthashastras apparently before that. But this one, which was discovered about 120 years ago, or rather rediscovered after being lost for a long time, tells us some very fascinating things about Chanakya's depth of understanding of human incentives and how corruption is caused and how it can be eliminated. Now, I want to sort of start off by talking about Singapore, because to me, I'm not talking about Singapore as a small country or whatever. I'm talking of the logic of governance, because the same logic applies also to China. In fact, China, as I've said, has actually imbibed many of the learnings from Singapore and continues to do that. And of course, countries like Australia and others have been inventing governance reforms on their own. But that's a separate story. I'll come to that. I've discussed that at length in Breaking Free of Nehru and many other places, and I'll come to that briefly in this talk. But I want to start with what Lee Kuan Yew said about corruption and how dangerous corruption is to a country. So he said that corruption will cause countries to fail, and he said honest mistakes or errors of judgments by ministers, however costly, are not as damaging to a country as the suspicion of bias because of corruption. Once a government is tainted with this, the contamination spreads throughout the administration. Then we shall go down the slippery slope, at the bottom of which are carcasses of so many corrupt governments whose peoples have had to suffer for the dishonesty and greed of those in authority. And I suspect in this case, he probably was referring to India as the largest such ultra or mega corrupt country, with the so-called Great Steel Frame, which is basically shackles imposed on India by the British, and this shackle is the basis of India's loot and plunder by the ministers, by the bureaucrats themselves today. So the total dramatic change levels difference in corruption and the perception about the importance of removing corruption you can see in Lee Kuan Yew and in Chanakya versus, let's say, India. And he says that Lee Kuan Yew says that once a political system has been corrupted right from the very top leaders to the lowest rungs of the bureaucracy, in fact, that's exactly what happened in India. Let me just add that. The problem becomes very complicated. The cleansing and disinfecting has to start from the top and go downwards in a thorough and systematic way. It is a long and laborious process that can be carried out only by a very strong group of leaders with the strength and moral authority derived from unquestioned integrity. And that is exactly what, by the way, Swarn Bharat Party is out here to offer India. A strong group of leaders with the strength and moral authority derived from unquestioned integrity. I mean, you can go into my background and check at any stage, at any point in my life, and the unquestioned integrity is something I've defended right through my life, and I'm very fussy about the kinds of people who join Swarn Bharat Party. What we are offering India is that strong group of leaders at the top who will actually cleanse India, because it is not the Modis who are totally ignorant and duds, I would call them, total dud basically, hollow vessel. We need people like Lee Kuan Yew. We need people like let's say the ones we are offering in Swarn Bharat Party. We need people like that. We need people who understand Chanakya. And these are the kind of people who can fix the system which has already been so badly corrupted. And so Lee Kuan Yew had this thing that he was a lawyer, he was trained in Oxford, etc. I think, and along with his wife, he was reasonably well-to-do as a lawyer when he came back to Singapore. And he wasn't really interested in a high salary for himself. But he knew that not drawing a high salary for himself was a very bad idea. It would set a very bad precedent for the country, and it would create complete danger and complications for Singapore. He said that too great a disparity between ministerial rewards and what ministers with business experience and professional qualifications could earn outside will make it increasingly difficult to assemble a successor government. So he said that, look, the point here is that we cannot have a great disparity between what we pay our ministers and what they can earn outside. This is one of the most fundamental principles of modern economics. The incentive constraint, the participation constraint, and an incentive constraint. And I've talked about this at length in one of my talks, which I gave at the Indian Institute of Public Administration in 2013. And that talk is mostly available on the internet as a video. But the point that you see this great fellow's insight. What he's saying is that we cannot afford to have this disparity between what ministers can draw outside the government and what they draw within the government. A little bit of disparity is fine. I mean, we can pay them a bit less than what they would draw otherwise, but we don't have to pay them extremely less. And that is one of the basic reasons why Singapore pays its prime minister, ministers, and bureaucrats extraordinarily well. And it holds them to account for integrity. There's the slightest, and I'll come to that in a second. But then he says, here's the thing that's very important to remember. And I think that's what Chanakya talks about. And that's what we know from our experience, that it is not only the salary that keeps people honest. That is, by the way, a basic requirement to continue with a strong integrity in the system. But it's not the only, it is not the sufficient condition. It is necessary, but not sufficient, as they say in physics or maths. So what we see is that Lee Kuan Yew says, no salary, however generous, can ensure the complete honesty and integrity with which ministers must discharge their duties. So what does he do in such a case? What does he recommend as a next step? Well, you read Chanakya and you will get the answer. But Chanakya is exactly saying the same thing. I've been saying exactly the same thing. Any sensible economist will say exactly the same thing. And he says, therefore, Lee Kuan Yew says, after the salaries are high enough, and this is my interpretation. So he says, after the salaries are high, then strict punishment is necessary. So what Lee Kuan Yew actually said is the following. If government workers are adequately paid, they deserve to be punished with severe penalties when they take bribes. The laws against corruption should be tightened to shift the onus of proof onto the person who possesses more assets than his income warrants. 2 to 3 big fish brought to justice successfully will have a salutary effect on everyone. And this is what he basically said, that once you have made very high salaries and good salaries for the top people, ministers and top bureaucrats, and in fact the entire bureaucracy, what you then need to have is a strong system of punishment. And if you want, by the way, to understand how Chanakya recommended this strong system of punishment, read his book, Arthashastra. Chanakya even went all the way to saying that if you are confirmed after your investigations, and by the way, all these investigations were to be conducted by the king and through private disguise and spies. Once the king was persuaded, then he was to actually take that corrupt minister, to slowly and to surreptitiously kidnap the corrupt minister, to take him to a distant place and finish him permanently. That was to be done in a manner that nobody would suspect what had happened. And so this is, by the way, the extreme form of punishment. But once that punishment occurs, there is simply a complete fear psychosis among the corrupt, because they don't know when they're going to be caught and who's going to catch them and what's going to happen to them. Now, I'm not recommending at all, by the way, and I don't think Lee Kuan Yew ever recommended or did such a thing, although they have death penalties for very small things like, drugs in your possession, bang, you're dead. So Lee Kuan Yew really implemented death penalties very well. Yeah, well, I wouldn't say very well, very strongly and excessively in some cases. But, and Chanakya was in favor of death penalties for the corrupt. But I'm not in favor of death penalties. What I would be saying is put these guys in jail behind the bars for life. Let them rot as ordinary prisoners, sleeping on the ground with 20 other people. Let them suffer, let them eat the food full of cockroaches or whatever, and I'm not saying that we should have that quality of food in prisons. We should definitely improve it. But what I'm saying is let them suffer for the rest of their lives and let others visit them and let that be advertised. That here was a senior minister and here was a senior bureaucrat who was caught taking bribes, and look at his life. For the rest of his life, he's sitting in prison. Take a picture, put a video, put it on television, let the whole country know, let there be a fear among the bureaucracy that they will be very badly punished after they have been already well paid. So we have a system of hiring, firing and promotion which needs to be consistent with this particular logic. This is why Singapore is such a great, phenomenally great country in terms of its delivery of government services at extremely low cost. It has got one of the lowest tax rates in the world. And it's not just because it's a small nation. It's actually because it's one of the most efficiently administered governments in the world. So you pay them very well, but you get a superlative government. So now I want to go and talk a little bit as an illustration about the Singapore's education system and how that actually works. And this is where I guess we get a real example of how these kind of principles that Lee Kuan Yew had embedded in Singapore will actually work. So there is an OECD report. I've written a great deal about this on my blog in March 2017. And what I think what we are seeing here is that OECD has done this analysis in a detailed report. And what it says, the OECD report says that in Singapore, meritocracy reigns all the way down the system. Meritocracy. Teachers, for instance, need to have finished in the top third of their class. Headmasters are often appointed in their 30s and rewarded with merit pay if they do well, but moved on quickly if their schools underperform. And tests are endemic. And I'm not talking about tests. I'm talking about the system. You see this beauty of this whole exercise. So what you're doing is you are recruiting people, and this is, by the way, a government run system, and I'm not in favor of government run education system, as you know. But even a government run system can do brilliantly if you apply the right incentives, which is what happens in Singapore. And by the way, this happens not only in education, it happens in things like airports or airlines. I mean, we have the Singapore Airlines is one of the world's best, and I love traveling in Singapore Airlines, and I detest the others, most of the others. And I've traveled in Air India; it's the most third-rate thing in the world. But what we're saying is that the principles of good governance can be applied even in a public sector setting. You may wish to even own a hotel in public sector, and I totally oppose that idea. But if you apply these principles, you will actually be successful in doing this thing efficiently. And it's very difficult to do this efficiently, and I won't go into how the Temasek and others work and how it's actually run in a completely privatized manner, effectively a privatized manner, the government public sectors. But look at education in Singapore. So the teachers are carefully selected. Okay, these teachers are selected from the top 1/3 of their of the students in the class, relevant class, and so this strong academic ability is given to them. Then prospective teachers receive a monthly stipend that is competitive with monthly salary for fresh graduates in other fields. So now you're not yet a teacher, you're just being selected as a teacher, and yet you're paid a very significant amount of money. Okay, so the salary, remember the salary point I mentioned about how you get good quality in governance. So these people are paid very well. They're the top people. They're selected very carefully. Then they are given this high salaries, and they must commit for at least 3 years. They must also have a great amount of interest in teaching, and then they are trained very thoroughly. And I won't go into details of the training. And finally, the salaries of the new teachers after they finish training, they are adjusted to ensure that teaching is seen as equally attractive to other occupations for new graduates. So the teacher salaries do not increase as much over time as those in private sector jobs, but there are many other career opportunities within education for teachers. So now if you remain a teacher, you will probably not be promoted very heavily. If you're a good teacher, you'll remain there. But if you're an outstanding teacher, you can then become a fantastic you get fantastic promotions, you get bonuses if you're a high performing teacher, and of course you get professional development and many other career development opportunities. You become a kind of middle management of the education system, you become leader of the system, and you can become the head of department at a very young age if you're really good. This is exactly how, by the way, good systems work, where you pay people very well at a good base level, you select them very well, they pay them very well, and then from them you pick and choose the ones who are really high performers and pay them even more, so that they don't go out, they actually stay with you. This is the basic model of education school system in Singapore, and as you can see, teaching has developed into a competitive and well-regarded occupation and is considered to be an honor to be a teacher in Singapore. This is something that we have completely lost track of in India, because now we're talking of paying teachers well in India, but of course we pay them well, but we have no accountability. And now what you see here is significant accountability that's built into the system, that unless you're really good, you're not even continued in your job. Now I want to talk about I mentioned briefly this public sector, and I won't go into details because I've done a fair bit of study of their, Singapore's water and other regulatory systems, and I find the same principles applying to everything that they do in Singapore, and that will also apply to their, Singapore Airlines and everything else. And I won't go into details there, but I'll just talk about the fact that this model is essentially a public sector governance model, and it works everywhere. It works in all aspects of government. Including, of course, the basic system like police and so on, which you need as a fundamental system in governance. Without that, you cannot really do anything. So Singapore has a phenomenal police system in terms of enforcement of the law. And yes, the laws are extremely dictatorial in some cases and prevent free speech. And we know how people like Charles Ringle were chased out of Singapore essentially. And I really wouldn't be very positive about some of these excessive restrictions in Singapore. But what I would say here is that if you have an incentive, if you want to create a system that really delivers what the government wants to deliver, you need to have a very good machine of government, which is what Singapore has. And by the way, China has been adopting this model for many years, and in fact it has got a public sector that is the world's most efficient. It is far more efficient than the private sector anywhere in the world. And China has, for example, taken over almost, it is building this huge electricity grids, and they're superlative grids. They don't allow the leakage of electricity for thousands of miles. And this particular thing has been done in public sector. So the Chinese public sector, which is based purely on the accountability models that are followed in Singapore, is delivering world best. Even better than the private sector, American private sector in many ways. And so we see the Chinese education system doing the same thing. And we know that in China, teachers are not promoted unless they actually produce results which are considered necessary minimum. And so you see the Shanghai results in PISA, they are the world's best, and Singapore is pretty close. And how do they do it? Well, they do it simply because they make sure that the teachers are held to account for results. And if you don't deliver, you're out and you don't get promoted and all that stuff. So China is not a system like in India, like a tenured system where you get in and you stay there forever and you can have unions, you can fight for your job. And by the way, the same malaise applies across many other parts of the West, including Australia, where, education has been declining very badly in the public sector. And I won't go into that details because that's part of, it sort of overlaps with some of the advice that I provide in government. And I won't talk much about that. But really, I would say that you need accountability systems, and if you build them, you can implement even things in the public sector. So, you don't have to be ideologically wedded to the public sector or to privatization, although I believe that will actually yield even better results through a good regulation. Now, what I'm saying here in my books and in my writings and other writings and manifesto of Swarn Bharat Party is a very sophisticated system of governance. You need to really fully understand its working before you can actually implement it. So I won't go into that particular model at the moment, but I want to sort of go back to this idea that you can implement this thing not only in small countries like Singapore, but in some of the largest countries. There's none larger than China, and China has the same principles right through its system. So when you look at this governance model, and you also, by the way, find similar things in Australia, and I've written a lot about this Australian model in my book and other such writings. And I've talked a lot about in my an article in Times of India, or for example in the Cabinet Secretariat newsletter in India. And I've explained how the Australian model really can work. But this is basically common sense, and in fact, it's a model that Chanakya had written 2,500 years ago. So why don't we understand how the governance systems work across the world? So this whole thing started by a person called T.N. Nayanan being interviewed by Karan Thapar a few years ago about his book on India. And what I find really it stretches me, it really perplexes me that all these guys are really talking very shallow. In a very shallow language. They're simply saying that we need more market reforms and all that stuff. Really, you don't need only that. Yes, by all means, have a little bit more of that. But that's not going to work when your entire fundamentals are gone. You do not have a rule of law in India. You don't have justice in India. You don't have roads in India. You don't have hygiene in India. The Swachh Bharat rubbish that we see everywhere. Yeah, it's a complete mess. So when your whole system is messed up, okay, you can apply as many economic reforms as you want, but it's not going to work. It's not going to give you the kind of results you want. You will still get a complete rubbish place, which is what India has become. In fact, the thing might become worse because the governance system is so bad that people are short-circuiting. Corruption is, wildly growing. And, I was just reading reports about BJP ministers in Assam. Of course, they'll be corrupt. Every single BJP minister is corrupt. And yes, some people say they're not. That's complete rubbish. How in heaven's name can you run, a party which has got this thousands of crores of rupees of propaganda and evil propaganda, I would say in many cases. How do you do this without money? And how do you expect people who are paid so poorly as our ministers are in India to actually, to remain honest? So the principles of economics apply to everything. We cannot treat governance as a black box. Anybody who thinks that governance is like a separate thing altogether to the economy is completely ignorant, and we should ignore that person. There's no point wasting time on people like Nayanan and even many others. I won't name them because there's not a single person on the other side. That is, there's nobody, not even a Vivek Debroy, not even Path Shah, not even Barun Mitra, not anybody in India, not a single person who has actually understood governance systems. And so what we hear is pure rubbish. We hear hand waving, even, Deirdre McCloskey, the standard economist, we've got this capitalism, you see the results of India. It's complete bunkum. These people have not paid attention to governance systems either in the West or in India. For example, has Deirdre McCloskey studied the Northcote Trevelyan report of England, which modernized its governance systems? Does she understand how that radically impacted British performance across the world? Does she understand? Did she pay attention to any of that in her books? I'm sure she did not. I have not unfortunately read all her books, but I suspect no, because she has not been talking about it at any point. She simply talks about market economy, price system, which is wonderful, but that's really essential economics. If you can't apply that economics to governance, and William Easterly, for example, I've been debating this with him, and then he just kept quiet because he had nothing to say, because he never thought about it. People like him who are highly regarded have never ever paid attention, and this is where you need to pay attention to detail, a lot of detail, extraordinary amount of detail. This is about the behavior of the players inside the government system. What do they do? Why do they do it? How are they hired? How they're fired? How they're promoted? If you don't understand that, you're wasting my time. Don't come and tell me about things like market economy, etc. Yes, of course we need market economy. That's common sense. But market economies necessarily are not the solution. In many cases, as I said, Singapore can achieve the same thing or even better using the public sector. So we don't necessarily need pure markets for everything, because markets have real market failures do exist, and I can tell you that the private sector will exploit, will cheat, will be as crooked as you can possibly imagine if it is allowed to be monopolistic, if it is allowed to have, to cut competition, which it does. And there's so much tendency. The banks, for example, across the world, they're fighting against cryptocurrency because their entire future as monopolies is at stake with this massively competitive system that is out there, which is now trying to come out. So, we have the private sector is not a saint. Do not ever imagine that when I talk of privatization, I'm sort of saying the private sector is the saint. No, I'm actually saying that the right incentives, where the checks and balances exist through good regulation, will lead you to better results than doing the same thing within government. However, if you wish to do the same thing within government, you can do that. And that will itself be a very high quality result, if you can understand what I've been just saying. And what I've been saying this for the last 20 years. Once again, I repeat my message. Guys, this is not something like a rocket science. This is common sense. I find it very hard to understand why there is such dramatic resistance in India to look at the government and the government system and to work out how it actually works. It is actually quite simple, quite obvious. Once you start paying attention to it, you will find out every single thing about Indian system and why it fails and why it must fail, and why people like Chanakya need to be revisited, understood, and we need to modernize our understandings based on the new public economics and so on, and apply those models. This is not rocket science. I honestly tell you, this is basic common sense. Okay. Once you understand it, you'll say, oh my God, this is common sense. Of course, as like gravity is common sense once you know about it, or you know about the stars are not really some dots in the sky, but actually independent, huge, suns, trillions of billions of light years away. How common sense that looks after you understand it. Similarly, India's failure will become very common sense to you once you really pay attention to what I've been saying for 20 years. It is not too hard to try to understand the governance system. It is not too hard to read up Lee Kuan Yew's writings. It is not too hard to understand Chanakya, his writings on corruption, for instance, on regulation of prostitution, of alcohol. Just try to figure out what he's saying. Why is he saying all those things? And you read Balbir Sihag's note on book on Kautilya, you'll understand that Chanakya was one of the greatest economists in the history of the world. And we need people like him. We need thousands of people like him who understand governance, who understand the economics of governance, who will then come forward and lead India and the party for that has already been created. Despite all my reluctance to create a party without the leaders already being there, we have a party we have done the other way around, where the leaders are now assembling. A party has been created. So please pay attention to what I'm saying. This is the answer to your problems in India, people. You understand governance, you understand economics, and you're done. And for that, all you need to do is to read my book, Breaking Free of Nehru. You need to read the Swarn Bharat Party manifesto. you need to probably listen to some of my podcasts. You need to probably listen to some of my videos. For example, the one I gave at the Institute of Public Administration in Delhi a few years ago. And once you've done all that, it's probably about 5 to 10 hours of your investment of your time. And then, guys, you're ready. You're ready to lead India. And then you can come and contact me, and I'll talk to you on the phone. We'll work out whether you're suitable to be a leader for India. Then you can actually join and contest elections and beat Modi, because he was a totally hopeless character. And the entire system that we are getting in India is so hopeless. I can't even explain it, how hopeless it is compared to what I'm offering. Mr. Modi is offering junk. I'm offering you the very best, India, and Modi is offering you pure junk, and you are not able to distinguish. Please try to do so. Well, that's all for today. I think this is a good enough 30-minute podcast, and I will upload this, and we'll have a conversation in the coming days. Thank you.